My presentation is about post-Soviet memorialization of Stalin-era repressions in Armenia. Studies of Armenian memory most often focus on the topic of the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, and of course, the memory of genocide is especially important for the Armenian diaspora, for which this memory served as a myth of beginning and was perceived as the main component of national identity, according to Ron Eierman and according to Armenian anthropologist Harutun Marutyan. Depending on the preferred theoretical framework, researchers consider the memory of the Armenian genocide also as a master narrative, like Dan Diner does, or as a root paradigm, as Nora Dadvig does, using Victor Turner term. But the memory of the genocide is also important in terms of its influence on other historical events commemorations. Sometimes it is perceived as a competing memory that has engulfed the entire space of memory. I'll try to show that this is not always the case. The memory of genocide, both institutional and individual, has developed a toolkit against the politics of forgetting, which is used to voice other dramatic events that are hushed up. In other words, different memories interact with each other not so much in a competitive mood, but rather as a multidirectional memory, which, according to Michael Rothberg, is such a public representation of dramatic memory that its cross-references produce more memory rather than reduce it. As a comparative case, I will focus mainly on the problem of the victim's memory and the attitudes towards the executioners of the Stalin-era repression. In Armenia, the genocide memory has turned from silence into loud recognition, and this experience of resisting the politics of oblivion becomes a valuable resource for other repressed collective traumas. While the Stalin purges in Armenia were accompanied by mass deportations, which according to the latest data affected at least 19,000 Armenians, having even today they do not become the subject of public discourse in Armenia, first of all, because of not being qualified as a national deportation, but targeting different social groups like Dashnaks, collaborators, former Turkish or Greek citizens, etc. So it's never turned down into a national narrative and stayed as a smaller group trauma. It can be seen well when comparing the two commemorations, the Armenian genocide and the Day of Remembrance of the Victim of Repressions in Yerevan. Both are included in the official calendar of post-Soviet Armenia. The Day of Repressions on June 14 has been commemorated in Armenia since 2006. This day was chosen because of the deportation campaign called Volna, the wave in Russia, happened on June 14 in 1949, when about 13,000 people were exiled from Armenia and 6,000 deportees were Armenian deportees were from Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the northern Black Sea region. The official opening of the memorial took place in December 2008, and the memorial was opened by President Serge Sargsyan. Representatives of the authorities, including the president, were present only the opening of the monument. After this, none of the authorities has taken part in these annual commemorations. Whereas not only over 500,000 people go to the genocide monument on average every year on April 24th, but under pandemic conditions in 2020, about 340,000 people registered on the online platform. There was also an opportunity to be registered virtually at the monument. This turned the monument not only into a memorial to the victims, but also into a memorial to those who remember. Following the genocide commemoration pattern, the commemoration of the Soviet-era repression, instead of having an everyday working museum, is focused on the one-day memorial concept. The Memorial of Repressed People is open only on June 14th. The other days, the huge memorial is locked and very few people have any information where it is located, and even that there is such kind of memorial in center of Yerevan. The memorial may seem very impressive. It is big enough, located on the top of Cascade. Excuse me. Okay, here it is. Which is a popular tourist destination in Yerevan. It seemed that the memorial should be much known, even more than the museums of the Soviet occupation in Georgia or the Baltic countries. However, because the memorial is accessible to the public only one day a year, following the examples of the main day of remembrance for the victims of genocide, it has become almost invisible and works as a very local memorial for a smaller group of the Stalin repressions survivors and their relatives. In 2021, 22, and last year, due to the international organization Memorial, there are activists who are mainly from Russia. A new way of the revitalization of the names of Stalin repression victims, which is famous returning of names, возвращение имен, is also taking place in Armenia. And this event trending to become a new tradition and to be integrated into the international commemoration of the Stalin era victims. The memorial organization banned in Russia was awarded the Nobel Prize in Peace in 2022. But this external involving in the memorial landscape does not solve the problem of facing own history of the Stalinist period. Members of the Hushamatian, another NGO, Armenian one, consisted mainly of the victims of the Soviet repressions, and their descendants for several years unsuccessfully tried to raise the issue of creating a museum at this memorial. They believed that only in this way it is possible to turn the memorial from one-day monument into a functioning memory. The case of the Genocide Institute Museum at the Genocide Memorial in Yerevan is a good example showing that a museum next to the monument or combined with it may be the only possible institutional solution for the memorial maintenance. The reason why the genocide memory not only has gradually grown into a master narrative in Armenian public discourse, but also serve as a language to describe other tragedies, including Stalin-era repression, could be understood due to Diner concept on ethnicized memory. Diner thinks that non-ethnic groups can't form a remembering social group and thereby explain the longevity of genocide memory as compared with other group memories. Alexander Atkins disagrees with this statement, providing numerous examples from post-Soviet Russia memory of the repressions. However, his examples are overshadowed by ethnicized memories specific for the same period. The punished people of the Stalin era, using the various commemorative practices, are more likely to remember Soviet repressions compared to the peoples who suffered from the Great Terror but were not directly targeted as an ethnic group. For example, memory trains, which following the example of Jewish pilgrimage tours to concentration camps, were also organized for the Kalmyks, one of the punished peoples completely deported to Siberia. The group of former deportees from Armenia to Siberia unsuccessfully attempted to organize the same themselves. While visiting not only the former Armenian settlements in Western Armenia, but even Derzor, the desert in Syria where thousands of deported Armenians died during the genocide, had become commercial projects for private travel companies due to their greater demand. The deportation of Armenians to Siberia was not ethnicized. It was not perceived as a deportation of punished peoples, and this plot fell out of the national narratives. In Barnaul, which was, this is the Russian city, which was a place of many exiles, there is a city monument to the repressed people. around this memorial, commemorations are regularly held only by the local German community, sometimes by Kalmyks, at least in 2017 when I was there. Although there are about 40,000 Barnaul residents themselves who are the local victims of Stalin's repression in this city. That is, even urban identity turned out to be an insufficient basis for the formation of the longevity of group memory. In another Siberian city that received many exiles not only of the Soviet but also of the pre-Soviet period, in Tomsk, in front of the local museums of memorial in the park, there are monuments set up by different ethnic communities having in Russian the status of the national minorities. That is, even the most superficial review of the memorial landscape confirms the Diner's assumption that the ethnicized memory has more resources for developing into a national master narrative. To compare, the Barnaul Armenian community could fund not only the annual commemoration of April 24th, but in 2015, in the year of the Armenian Genocide Centennial, a huge model of the Yerevan Memorial to the genocide victims was installed in the courtyard of the local Armenian church. But the Soviet deportation of Armenians just there to Siberia has no any commemorations. I am on purpose referring to these cases of the commemorative practices of the Armenian diaspora in Russia, for which this deportation was actually a part of their microhistory. I think for the so-called old diaspora in other countries, these events are not reflected in their memorial landscape at all. Whereas it is difficult to find an Armenian community in diaspora, but there would not be a monument dedicated to genocide, and now also to those who perished in the Karabakh Wars, unfortunately, to one more dramatic national narrative. The experience of the unrecognized genocide memory created mechanisms of grassroots resistance to the policy of denialism. In post-Soviet Armenia, as a result of the dependence on Russia, which did not really contribute to public discussion of the topics of repressions, it was rather to policy of oblivion concerning the Stalin-era repressions. However, their memorialization took place due to the tools used when dealing with the genocide memory, recording the oral histories and their archiving as the historical testimonies. No surprise that those tools were provided by the Armenian diaspora. Thus, in post-Soviet Armenia, the first documentary, which is called Enemy of Peoples, based on the oral histories of the Stalin repressions, was created by an American-Armenian filmmaker, Zare Cheknavorian. The project, by the way, was funded by AGBU. Zare Cheknavorian recorded about 100 video interviews, each at average 1 hour, with former prisoners of the Gulag or deported to Siberia. While Armenian researchers, including myself, within the project of the Armenian totalitarists, began to record this kind of materials only 15 years later. The family stories of these people, as a rule, begin not from the deportation and not even with the birth year of the narrator, but with the history of the genocide, from the moment when their parents hardly escaped the massacres and moved to eastern Armenia, which soon became the Soviet Republic. Such start of the narration is because the deportation of many families to Siberia was often caused by their former Turkish citizenship. The order of the Minister of State Security of the USSR number 00183 on the deportation of 1949 concerned primarily former Turkish and Greek citizens. Therefore, people who barely escaped death in Ottoman Turkey made up 68% of the deported families from Armenia in 1949. Moreover, at their new destinations in Siberia, In the registration books, they were abbreviated as Turks, and they had to put their signature under such definition regularly at the local militia offices. In the biography of our interlocutors, three regimes converged, Young Turks, fascism, and Stalinism, the crimes of which Hannah Arendt in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism, and even Pope Francis II in his speech on centennial anniversary of the Armenian genocide put in one line. Moreover, some of our interlocutors became the victim of the Soviet regime because of suffering from genocide or captivity in fascist camps. We often came across family stories when the same family, the same people, were victims of all three regimes. Escaping the genocide, they moved to Armenia. Here they had to serve in the Soviet army and participated in World War II, where they found themselves in fascist captivity and then were exiled to Siberia with their families in 1949 because of this captivity. Comparative plots of 20th century Armenian history differ from the Armenians of Armenia and of the diaspora. While for the latter the master narrative of collective memory is clearly the theme of the Armenian genocide, there are two master narratives for the citizens of Armenia, two languages of memory representation. This is not only genocide, but also the Second World War, which in the Soviet Union was called exclusively the Great Patriotic War, and the memory of it was sacralized. Until now, its even academic revisiting in Russia is strictly censored. For example, comparisons between Stalinism and fascism are prohibited by law. In Soviet Armenia, the memory of genocide and of the lost homeland was persecuted in the first half of the 20th century, the survivors struggling for the public representation of their drama in the second half of the century. Compare rallies in 1965, the Genocide Memorial, which was built in 1967, to become an important component of the state politics of independent Armenia. This is a narrative about victimization, suffering, and surviving against the racist plans of a treacherous enemy. The second master narrative is a heroic text of the Second World War, where the enemy is described as absolute evil, which was opposed primarily by the Soviet people, including the Armenian people, who fought both as part of the Soviet troops and in the Allied armies. The representation of this war in public space during the Thaw period, Khrushchev period, and the Brezhnev so-called stagnation period, 1960s until 80s, strongly influenced the identity of the Homo Sovieticus. It is a deeply internalized language of memorial practices. Therefore, many post-Soviet countries refer to this war, to its commemorations, when they want to celebrate their new victories. For example, as the Armenian side did in the First Karabakh War, compare the coincidence of Shusha seizure celebration with May 9, the victory celebration of the Great Patriotic War, and how Azerbaijan does after the victory in the Second Karabakh War of 2020, which on the official invitations of the embassy in Moscow, this war they called the Patriotic War, and it was written in their invitation. And in the first year of the celebration of this victory in Azerbaijan, a parade of the Regiment of the Immortals was organized. This Regiment of Immortal concept that appeared in the memorial practice of the post-Soviet Russia, when people tried to oppose their personal and tragic memory of the war to the official great victory. This initiative was adopted by the Russian authorities into an official celebration, and in Azerbaijan it has been transformed into a strictly controlled official memory where the army carries portraits of the perished of one formal while marching. Such a language of patriotic war is understandable not only to the Soviet and post-Soviet communities of the national states, but it is also a shift to the language of the former metropolis, Russia, whose position in the Karabakh conflict is still palpable, despite of the ethnic cleansing of all Armenians in Karabakh in September 2023. In this sense, the use of the memorial language of post-Soviet Russia when describing its national victories indicates rather an important addressee of these festivities or the colonial languages of multi-directional memory, which makes one talk about victories and failures in a memorial language of others in order to correctly heard. The text above the genocide, before becoming the main narrative, passed their latent period of mimicry. Kremlin authorities, according to Ronald Sunny, learned from the history of the collapse of the also Hungarian and Ottoman empires that it is better to be friends with the national elites and help them to build the national states, but that should be under control of Communist Party, or they created the so-called affirmative action empire, according to Terry Martin. So the principal socialist in content, but national in form, Stalin proclaimed as a main point of the national politics of the Soviet Empire. Therefore, many intellectuals looked for some loopholes where they, under the guise of national culture, they could voice the issue of the genocide. For example, folklorist Vergennes Vazlian disguised the collection of eyewitness stories by formalizing her work as a collection of folklore for the study of Western Armenian dialects. By the way, these days she celebrated her 90 years anniversary. The architect from Gyumri, former Leninakan, this is the second city in Armenia, Rafael Yegoyan, who listened many stories about the massacre of Armenians next to Gyumri Gorge called Jarti Dzor, which means a massacre gorge, suggested the local administration of Leninakan to erect a monument in memory of killed Armenians in the massacre realized by the Turkish army in 1920s. The memorial was formally indicated as a decorated stone source of water, which was often built along the road. The local authorities financed the construction of this monument without indicating in their official report the true purpose of the memorial. When the local taxi drivers learned about the author's idea, they collected money, offering to use it for the memorial. This example shows how the memory politics of the local authorities and personal memory of an average resident coincide, both being directly affected by the genocide. The head of the Communist Party of Armenia, Yakov Zarubyan, in 1964 and 65 began negotiations with Moscow regarding the construction of the national monument dedicated to genocide, although here too the aim of the monument was originally disguised by the official narrative of Armenia's resurrection after the World War I. In the center of the memorial, built in 1967, was an eternal flame, which in the 1960s appeared as an obligatory attribute of many monuments to the unknown soldier dedicated to the perished in World War II. So, despite the monument reflects the very national narrative, the Armenian catastrophe is presented in the same language and the same visual forms as the memorials of the Second World War. As we see, the formula of the national policy of the USSR, national in form and socialist in content, here turned out to the contrary one. It's more likely socialist or rather Soviet in form and national in content. There were many attempts to testify the loss of their homeland in some form of publicity at the individual level as well, which although not affected with genocide memory, but developed in a similar way. For example, on the gravestones of genocide survivors who died in Soviet Armenia, not only the year of birth and death of the deceased was indicated as usually, but also the place of birth, the name of the settlement in Turkey, from where the deceased was forced to immigrate. Thus, the tombstone was supposed to act as an evidence of the displacement and residence from Western Armenia and the deprivation of their homeland. I recorded a similar practice among the Armenians deported to Siberia in 1949, who after their rehabilitation and return to Armenia began to transport the ashes of their relatives who died in Siberia to their homeland. On the gravestones of these people, next to the year of death, an inscription appeared about the place of death, the first burial, and the year of reburial. Until 2008, various tragedies were compared to genocide, presenting the Armenians as victims and enemies presented as Turks. However, after the above-mentioned killing March 1st in Yerevan in 2008, the ethnic demarcation between victims and executioners began to blur. That year, I mean 2008, during a morning demonstration at the memorial complex, along with the usual genocidal posters, the opposition carried a poster with the inscription 1.5 million plus 10, because 10 people were killed on March 1st. It was a paraphrase of a poster about the murder of the Turkish journalist of Armenian origin, Hrant Dink, 1.5 million plus 1. The placement of victims and executioners within common ethnic boundaries was also made in 2014 regarding an attempt to erect a monument to Anastas Mikoyan in one of the central parks of Yerevan. Mikoyan, as one of the rare longer livers of the Soviet nomenclatura, turned out to be a very convenient occasion to launch public discussions on the Soviet past, since they participated in many important historical events. Historian Petro Shalkaryan studied in detail about Mikoyan's positive role in the rehabilitation of the Soviet regime victims in general and the Armenian ones in particular. He has found very important facts about Mikoyan's public talks on Charans in Yerevan State University on March 11, 1954, after which the process of Charans rehabilitation was launched. While the process of rehabilitation of the Stalin victims in general began after prominent talk by Khrushchev only 2 years later, in 1956. Charans is the prominent Armenian poet who died in Soviet prison during the Great Terror. Although for honesty, it must be admitted that the change in relation to the memory of Charans and some other prominent Armenian writers did not mean the rehabilitation of other victims or an appropriate way of rehabilitation of their rights. Anyway, he became a symbol of political repression and their rehabilitation at the same time. By the way, the international commemoration in memory of political victims, Return of Names, about which I mentioned, and which is annually organized by the above-mentioned memorial in Yerevan, take place near this monument. And after the recent death of Russian political prisoner Alexei Navalny, the USA and UK ambassadors laid the flowers here. Coming back to Mikoyan issue, it should say that in dialogue with the authorities, representatives of the movement against the standing up of the monument appealed to the facts of Mikoyan's biography, which could be interpreted as crimes of varying degrees, from national, more often stories related to genocide, to indifference to repressed friends and relatives. But main accusations were based on the document widely circulated in social media, where Mikoyan asks for additional 700 executions for Armenians, while documents on shooting much more victims of non-Armenian origin. For example, 22,000 Polish officers in Katyn case or 5,000 prisoners in Irkutsk were less accentuated. The political context, the association of Armenia with the Russia-led custom union instead of the European Union, unexpectedly proclaimed by President Serge Sargsyan on the 3rd of September 2013, created a suitable space for hot discussions on relations, historical or current, with Russia. So, the proposal to erect Mikoyan's monument became a part of the discourse on the recolonization of Armenia by Russia, while the supporters of the monument appealed to its positive image, referring to Mikoyan's input in the resolution of Caribbean crisis, the successful modernization of the food industry, etc. At the same time, ambiguities in the biographies of many political figures, both Soviet, like Anastas Mikoyan, and anti-Soviet Garygin Nizhde, who is a prominent political and military figure in 1920s, are good examples of selective oblivion when, as Aleida Osman states, national memory is subordinated to a sense of pride and to memory of one's suffering, but one's fault rarely gets access to the national memory. While the protests in Armenia against the monument to Anastas Mikoyan stopped its erection, accusations from Russia and Azerbaijan concerning the monument to Garygin Nizhde began immediately after its opening in 2016. For them, Garygin Nizhde was only a Nazi collaborator, while the Armenians consider Nizhde the savior of Zangezur, now the Syunik, who didn't allow this region to follow the fate of Nakhichevan and Karabakh, which were included into Azerbaijan a bit later in the early 20th century. Some disputes over the monuments to Nizhde continue to this day, but the border between the opponents' camps basically coincides with state borders. There is a consensus within Armenia about the important role of Nizhde in the national development of Armenia, and selective oblivion allows to bypass the topics of collaborationism. And if in the disputes about the monument to Mikoyan, the ethnic framework for the executioners was expanded and embraced the image of a Soviet official of the Armenian origin, in the case of Nizhde, they were narrowed so much as to pass only the image of a national hero. Even his collaborationism was interpreted as an attempt to protect Armenia in the case of possible Turkish attack, which was expected during the Second World War. The memorial initiatives in the post-Soviet Armenia indicate that the attitude towards so-called executioners is no longer so unambiguous. It must be said the tradition of civil initiatives to erect monuments through the efforts of community in a widespread practice in Armenia. It gained its greatest scope after the Second World War. More than 600 such monuments have been recorded in Armenia, and the process of their installation continues to this day, because the relatives of the victims perceived this monument as a symbolic grave of those who did not return from the war. It is not surprising that some of these monuments turned out to be close to religious structures, churches, places of pilgrimage, and so on. That is, these places of memory can be considered not so much as memorial reminders of the past, but, following Paul Connerton, as loci of memory, topography with a certain form of behavior, rituals inscribed in everyday life. Unlike monument cenotaphs to those killed in the Second World War, where the state or local administration sponsored and encouraged their installation, monuments to the repressed are usually erected at the expense of the families of the victims. They are, of course, still significantly smaller in number, are recorded about 15 such monuments. What they have in common with the monuments of the Second World War is that they also bear concrete names. The initiators of the erecting the monuments to the repressed are usually their descendants. Even the official memorial complex in Yerevan dedicated to victims of Stalin purges was designed by the architect Jim Torosyan, who himself was the son of a repressed person. In rare cases, such an initiative comes from representatives of local administration, as was the case in the village of Arachadzor in the south of Armenia, in Syunik. The decision of the chairman of the community to erect a monument in 2011 with the names of fellow villagers who were executed by shooting appeared under the influence of reading the book On This Side of the Iron Curtain, published by local historian Grisha Sambatyan. And the most notable part of this monument is the free space left after the names of the repressed to be able to write in the names of the victims who may be found in the future. This free space defined the new concept of the monument as an unfinished text, as an invitation to conversation, and where instead of period there is an ellipsis. Another important point for local initiatives to establish a monument to the repressed is the choice of the site. In rare cases, the location is determined by the topography of the historical event. The difficulty is that the place of executions were not recorded anywhere, and it is impossible to restore them even from archival documents. There is some oral information that requires additional research, as it was the case in the already mentioned massacre gorge near Leninakan. Some of our interlocutors argued that the victims of the Great Terror in 1936 and 37 were buried there also, just several years later after Turkish massacre. The first Soviet memorial stone in memory of the political victims of the Soviet regime in Armenia was erected in 1993, which was replaced in 2008 by a cross stone in the English Park of Yerevan, at the place where 21 arrested persons accused of organizing uprising in 1921 were cruelly executed by the Bolsheviks. For the initiators of the monument to the repressed in the village Goht, an important message was the lessons of history that need to be learned by descendants. Therefore, they chose a site for the monument near the school. It was important for the initiators that the monument does not have any religious connotation. Therefore, they did not make it in the form of a cross stone, as usually genocide memorials are created, especially in diaspora, setting up near a church, but wanted to emphasize that the monument has a civic message, both for memory and oblivion. Forgetfulness here acts as a punishment. In the center of the monument, the names of the victims are indicated, and in the upper part, its purpose is carved in memory of the Gokhtians repressed in 1937 and 38. As the authors explained, they deliberately chose such an inscription so that Stalin's name was not mentioned in it, because he was unworthy to be immortalized. At the same time, Among the names on the monument was the name of the person who reported on the other victims indicated on the same stone. Those, in turn, having conspired as retribution, named him as one of their associates. As a result, the informer was shot as well as those on whom he reported. Thus, the name of both the victims and the traitor, who in turn also became a victim, are recorded on the same monument. And as the initiators explained, the purpose of the monument was to raise the issue of guilt and accuse the regime that forced people to denounce each other. And those who fell, both victims and executioners, were perceived as victims of the regime, of which they saw Stalin as the main architect. Therefore, unlike their local executioners, they deprived him of their right to memory. It is difficult to find the appropriate public, non-private space for the new monuments. It is required to go through some bureaucratic procedure for getting the permission for that. The easiest solution to this problem is to erect a monument on a private property. Thus, the new memorial landscape appeared on a private territory with the function of a public space. Sometimes the text itself for such monuments is very private, however, its own family and relatives as an addressee. For example, in the village of Vartablur, a monument to repressed relatives was presented in the form of a genealogical tree, which indicates the family ties of 17 victims of the same family in different ways of repression. The monument to the repressed from this family is presented on the territory of a private garden of one of the descendants, which is gradually turning into a public memorial park where there are several other monuments that have nothing to do with family history. This memorial park is an example of alternative shifting of private memory into public space. In Gyumri, the choice of a place for the repression victims' memorial is in the church square because the monument is dedicated to the executed priest of this diocese. And the cross that fell from the dome of the church in one of the neighboring villages, Haikadzor, had been set up as a monument. The cross was badly damaged. According to the oral stories, at different times the Bolsheviks fired at it on one side and Turkish soldiers on the other. The church is located on the border between Armenia and Turkey. Once on the center of Gyumri, this monument at the same time became an object of worship as a religious artifact which believers treat as if it were a cross in a church. For tourists, the bullet holes left on the spherical base of the cross became a place for a tourist ritual throwing coins. So, to conclude, I tried to demonstrate how the traumatic memory of genocide survivors and repression survivors interact multidirectionally, while the memory of genocide has become an important part of not only the politics of memory in post-Soviet Armenia, but was influenced by the Soviet patriotic war narration of the Soviet period as well. The memory of the repressions has been rather part of the politics oblivion, largely due to cautious relations with Russia, which since the mid-2000s began to revise its negative attitude towards the Soviet past. The policy of oblivion of the Soviet past at the same time created fertile ground for less politicization of the collective memory of the repressions. This opened up more space for counter-memory, for expressing an ambiguous attitude towards the victims and executioners of Soviet repression. The perspectives of victims and executioners have been reflected differently on the memorial landscape. Local initiatives of memorializing the victims of the Soviet regime reveal a wide spectrum of interpretations of these repressions, distinct from the unambiguous message of the main memorial in Yerevan. That's all. Thank you.